Hello guys, this is Panzermeister36 and today is going to be a post-build review of Rifield's brand spanking new kit. That is kit number 5086, the StuG 3 Ausf.G late production. Now there is a interior and non-interior option for this kit. This video concerns the non-interior option. This kit, like I said, is brand new. I pre-ordered it so I could get my hands on it super fast, and it's still not even available everywhere in the world yet. But in this video, I will give you my full rundown of the kit. I'll talk about the quality of the build, any issues, and we'll also talk about historical accuracy and some small changes you can make and some aftermarket you can get to make it more accurate if that's your kind of thing. After all, I'm the guy who loves the Sturmgeschutz. I've built 20 of these things, and I was really looking forward to this kit because now we finally have a proper and accurate late production StuG. Now, like I said in the intro, this is a post-build review, so this is a kit review when I've already built the kit. This allows me to talk about a bunch of other things that I can't cover when just looking at how pretty everything is in the box. I can actually review not only the detail, but the quality of assembly, instruction errors, and how everything fits together. So these post-build reviews are much more useful than the in-box review. I'm also going to overlay some clips so you can see in more detail what I'm specifically talking about when I'm discussing things that were tough to put together or just anything like that. So to begin, I'm going to just point out some of the cool features on this vehicle that make it a late production kit. I'll also point out anything that I've added that isn't stock, and then we'll go into the full step-by-step. So this is a late production StuG 3 built at the Alket factory. Two factories made StuGs, Alket and MEAG. MEAG made less vehicles, they're less common. And also, if you see a StuG with a 105mm gun, those were only ever built at Alket. This kit gives you the option for both guns. So these late vehicles can be identified by features such as the cast manlet that includes the coaxial machine gun, interlocking hull front armor, the late types of muzzle brakes. They give you a few options in the kit. You got the steel return rollers that you can maybe see up in there. The roof has 5 crane mounts, which are those little circular pegs right here and there. You also have the late machine gun shield and the close defense weapon grenade launcher. The bolts on the roof are exposed. They stick up over the actual edge. There's also exposed bolts on the rear ventilator here. There's a bracket for hooks that hold the engine deck hatches open. The hull rear has the interlocks, which was introduced earlier on, but it's also been simplified with only 2 strips of bolts. You can see 1 strip there and 1 strip there. Earlier vehicles have 4 strips because there's extra bolts there and there. And these really late vehicles also had reduced bolts, so instead of being 3 per strip, there's only 2. You also have a late tow bar on the back there. You can just see a little bit of it there. And there's a few other things that I actually added myself for the late vehicle historical accuracy. Those are things like I added a different rear light as a spare part from a Dragon kit. I added a T-Rex 3D printed late type of fire extinguisher. I added a different foot for the jack over here. That's why you can see there's a great part. I will add different mesh for these vents. The kit gives you photo etch mesh there, which is fine, but the mesh pattern actually changed on these really late vehicles. I know it gets really nitty-gritty here, but I did order some mesh there from RFM model, which will be here eventually. Another late feature I added are the late tow cable clamps that are boxy style. The kit gives you the earlier ones, which are more rounded. And I should point this out earlier, but the late vehicles also have the solid 80mm armor here in front of the loader. The kit gives you that, but the part wasn't quite right and will require some work to make it all look nice. So I just used a spare part from a Dragon kit there. I also added this chain, which is a Model Railroad actual scale chain. The kit gives you a photo etch strip, which looks okay. And there's a few spots where I added some resin weld decals, which are these little black strips you can see in some spots. But overall, as you can see, most of the things I pointed out as interesting late features are included in the kit. And the few things I added are small details like the tow cable clamps, the fire extinguisher, the rear light, and the mesh pattern. Those are pretty minor, so I say this kit is like 95% of the way there for being historically accurate, and also builds up pretty well, so it's definitely a recommended kit for me. Alright, now let's go to the step-by-step. This might get a little bit long, but I want to give you guys the full detail and all the errors and things that will help you build this kit when you buy it, because you should. So right off the bat, when you start putting together the hull, you can see that it's a little bit complicated, and that's because there's two options for this kit, the interior and the non-interior. The non-interior kit still uses the same hull as the interior kit, so there's a lot more complex assembly because they have to mold detail on the inside faces of parts and make everything look more detailed. Now that makes the non-interior kit overly complicated inside, and the assembly of the lower hull, where there's 18 parts to get just the hull tub together, on Dragon kits that's just one part. And it's not that much work, but it's work that isn't visible in the end. So if I hold the vehicle up, you can probably see that there's the exhausts are hidden underneath there, and you can see there's a couple of little scallops. You'll see the little black cutouts there on the exhaust to correspond with the late tow bar here. Those scallops are actually molded onto the exhausts. Now Dragon didn't do that, and it became a bit of a fit issue on their kit, but they actually gave those scallops to you on this kit when everything fits together properly on the rear hull with the late tow bar, which itself has excellent weld detail. I did add this little chain to it just to make it look a little more detailed. It's an HO scale chain from Diesel Details. Also in the rear hull you can see that there's the air deflectors, which are these parts here. The kit parts are a little bit overly thick and there are some pin marks on them. So I just solved both those issues by sanding them down and getting them more scale thick. And when they're that thin anyways, they look a lot better, and you can even bend them by hand and make them look like they're fragile sheet metal, which gets dinged up pretty easily. Also, if you want to make a really late vehicle, you should leave the air deflectors off, as it seems like they're missing on most late vehicles. But I'm doing not a super late vehicle, just a normal late vehicle, so I left them on. Also concerning the rear hull, there's a few parts that are called part C53 that you should leave off. Earlier on I pointed out that there's reduced numbers of bolts on the rear hull here. Those bolts correspond to those uprights. You can leave them off, but you can't even see it in the end anyways because it's all hidden up inside the vehicle. On the very bottom of the lower hull, they have you fill a port, which is correct, and they point this out in the instructions. But instead of using putty, which I think is what they want you to do, I actually just glued the port in place, and then I used my sprue cutters and cut it flush and then sanded it down. And that just took care of filling it in a much quicker and easier way than using putty and waiting for it to dry and then probably adding a second round of putty. I like to do this method of using spare parts to fill the hole and then just cut it flush, sand it down, because it works much faster. So like I pointed out before, the hull assembly is multiple parts. There's not actually a hull tub. You have to glue the sides and the front and rear on. And my fears that this was not going to go together perfectly well did come true, because there was a little bit of a warp, not a lot, but a little bit at the hull front. Now I fixed this by skipping ahead in the instructions and gluing on the parts which are known as the hull side extensions. I glued them on much earlier than they want you to because that helped me square everything up. I also glued on the transmission plate, again earlier than they want you to, at the same time here, and then I actually use a clamp to make sure everything was locked in place and square. And this worked. This actually made the hull now finally square, but it did require deviating from the instructions a little bit. So in this kit you can make the suspension workable, or you can leave it all fixed in place. They explain this in the instructions. If you want to make it workable, you have to cut off a peg underneath each of the swing arms for each road wheel. And then because you have the full torsion bars in the kit and they're locked on the opposite side with all those extra 18 parts I talked about earlier, you can actually have it work as it does in real life. Now because the suspension is workable, the shock absorbers actually have two options. So you got the solid one-piece ones, which are the same as in every Dragon kit ever, but you also have the 4-piece workable ones, which is really cool. They're actually fully workable and they pivot and they expand and contract like a shock absorber. And that's really useful if you want to do the workable suspension, but it's also really useful if you want to do the StuG lean, which isn't exactly historically accurate, but it looks cool, where some people make the front of the StuG leaning down a little bit. If you did that in the Dragon kit, you had to actually trim the shock absorber because it doesn't compress, it's one part. But on this kit, it'll just compress for you as you make that lean happen. So looking at the interior here, you can see my brutally half-cut torsion bars and the fact I left off some of the parts because you can't see them. You'll also notice a lot of these kind of weird sprue remains things. They're like corresponding with the ejector pin marks, which are everywhere. I'm not really sure what these are all about. They're just molding things. But there's a lot of them, and they're also sometimes kind of in awkward locations in parts that kind of have to rotate and stuff. But they're pretty easy to pop off. Now this does blemish all the interior surfaces of the kit, so I'm not sure how that's going to look when you're putting together the full interior version of this kit, if you're going to have to fill all those things, because some of them go through electrical conduits and a bunch of detail, which is going to be a pain in the butt. But I don't have that version of the kit, so I don't know. So now in the instructions is when they would have you glue on the transmission plate, which I discussed doing earlier. I also changed the order that everything happens here because they want you to later on glue the superstructure to the fenders as its own assembly, and then later on even further you put together the engine deck. This makes no sense. I don't know what's going on here. Don't do this. Glue the engine deck on now, then the fenders, and then the superstructure after. This way everything will fit together much easier, and it'll also not have gaps and weird spots. So in the glacis plate, which is this part here, the upper angle of the hull, you should cut off the locating point for the chain for the barrel support. That position for that chain mount is incorrect for this vehicle. It should be higher up. They got mixed up between the two factory features here, MEAG versus Alkit. So I cut that off, sand it flush, and then because I already glued the hull front extensions on earlier and they have weld detail, I had to then kind of slide this plate in. It wasn't hard, but you can't just pop it on. You have to slide it in like that. That way everything fit together. Maybe I should have glued it on earlier when I put on the whole side extensions here, just to make it a little bit easier, but this wasn't an issue. I just had to kind of slide it in at a different angle. I also put on the bow plate at this point, which is the lower plate down here. This is an 80mm solid plate. As it's a very thick German marmor plate, you can add some texture to it, and I also did add the torch cuts along the edge, which is just easy using a hobby blade and just scraping little torch cuts on the side, and you can make the texture with putty or glue, whatever you want to do there. There's plenty of options. And then when I glued this in place, it wasn't exactly perfect, so I just used a clamp to make sure everything was going to stay straight. So now in the kit they have you putting on the wheels and stuff like that, and only now would they have you, according to the instructions, actually put on the hull side extensions, which again I put on much earlier to make it all square up. You also put on the final drive at this point, and they show you putting on these two drain plugs, and it's a little bit unclear on the instructions about where exactly those are supposed to go, so look at my clip here as to the actual position of them. There are poly caps for all the wheels in the kit apart from the return rollers, but the poly caps for the road wheels on my kit, the whole sprue was short shot, so they were unusable. And because of that, my road wheels are a little bit loose and wobbly, but they're held on right now by the tracks, so it's okay. For the idler wheel, there was a little bit of flash, which is really the only spot there was any flash in this kit, but it was easy to clean up. And then you actually put together with a photo etch ring inside there for that nice welded ring detail that should be there. And there's also a poly cap to keep it in place nicely. And the same goes for the drive sprocket. It also has a poly cap. And the way it goes together is quite novel, but actually very intelligent. That's a very good way of putting together the sprocket. So the kit gives you workable plastic tracks. They are a little bit of work to put together, but they're actually not that bad, and I did like them. Now they give you a jig for putting everything together. They actually gave me in my kit for some reason 2 jigs, which you can glue together for an extra long jig. And then you put the individual link tracks into the jig, and then there's also these sprues that have all the pins which pop into place. It's pretty smart the way it goes together. Now there is a little bit of cleanup because the tracks are on a sort of sprue, but it's fairly straightforward and quick. And then you line everything up, put the pins in place, and because they're on that kind of sprue, they actually all line up together, and then you just run a little bit of extra thin cement along the end there. I cut them off with a fresh hobby blade, and it actually worked very well, and the tracks are very workable. Now the kit tracks are type 3A tracks, which are an earlier type of track that's more common for like 1941, 42. 45, usually the vehicles should have the type 6 track, but I did find 2 pictures of late StuGs with this type of track as they give you in the kit. So I'm not going to say it's wrong, but it's mostly wrong, and you should really have a type 6 track. So I will eventually add the type 6 tracks Alright, now for the superstructure. Much like the hull, it's a little bit overly complicated due to the fact that there's an interior option in the kit, or at least a different boxing of the kit. So there's extra parts versus the Dragon and TACOM kits, but it's not that bad. Everything goes together really well in the end anyways. Now when you glue the superstructure to the hull, make sure you don't forget to put on that little strip of bolts. It's hidden in the instructions, so you might miss it. You can see some putty here where I've had to fill some holes. Those holes usually correspond to the earlier type of StuG hatch, which opens forward and back. On these late vehicles, it opens side to side. So those holes should not be there. Our model didn't mold a new sprue or a new part for the back there, so those holes are still present from the earlier version of the kit. Now, it's pretty easy. I just fill them with a little bit of putty and then sand it smooth. So it's not exactly a big issue, but it would be nice if they had just given us a proper new rear superstructure piece, especially because it's separate from the rest, so it wouldn't be too hard to mold a new part there. Alright, now let's talk about the loader's armor. That is this piece of armor right here that corresponds to where the loader eventually kind of sits further back. This is a solid 80mm plate on these late StuGs, and on early vehicles it's kind of like on this side, it's a 50mm piece and then 30mm is bolted on. Later vehicles, it's solid. Now what Ryfield model did, they gave you this. This is the 50mm plate, and then on their other version they have the bolted plate that goes on, but on this one they just give you like a solid plate to put on, and that's not exactly right, because first of all there's a big gap you would have to fill, and then also it doesn't follow the scallop on the front there that corresponds to the gun, so you would have to extend that with putty. And really what I would do is I would not use this part at all, and I would just lay this down on some styrene and then trace it out and then cut a new part that would follow the scallop anyways, and then maybe add my own weld or something like that. And you've got spare hooks in the kit anyways, so you could just put those onto that new part you make. But I had a spare Dragon part, so I just used that because it is correct. And like on the bow, I did give it a little bit of texture and a little bit of torch cuts on the top and the edges because it's a solid 80mm plate, and German 80mm plates are usually kind of beefy like that. Now in the instructions, they look at the fenders briefly here and have you put on a few parts of photo etch. This is just like the Dragon kits, except arguably it's done a little bit better. Just some nice photo etch details here that require minimal to no bending. Glue them in place and they look really, really good, and they look appropriate thickness for the real parts. Now suddenly the instructions jump to the gun. I don't know why they don't continue with the fenders, but they just go to the gun here for a minute. So they have options for the 75mm and also the 105mm, and you have a whole breech for both, which is really cool because Dragon never gave you the 105 breech. The thing is though, if you want to do a 105 StuG, the Sturmgeschutz as we call it, assault howitzer, this is the gun they give you in the kit. It's not right. This is a mid-style cast mantlet with no coaxial machine gun, muzzle brake. On late StuGs, like the kit builds, they redesigned the recoil system for the 105, made it bigger so they could delete the muzzle brake. So because it was bigger, it would only fit into the bolted mantlet, which is given in the kit as an unused part. So if you ever see a late Sturmgeschutz StuG with 105, it will always have bolted mantlet with the barrel and no muzzle brake. So like I said, you could at least use the mantlet given in the kit, and they even give you the wider collar to fit the 105. But you're going to have to get an aftermarket barrel from RB models or whatever. If you do that, you also have to add the welds in those little kind of slots there, because for some reason there's no weld detail on the bolted mantlet in this kit. So I just avoided all that by building a 75mm version. The 75mm is fine. You get a very nice cast mantlet with the coaxial machine gun. It's got great cast texture on the sprue there, but there are some pin marks in the back you have to fill. You get a one-piece slide molded barrel with very minimal seam lines and minimal sprue attachment points. There's only 2 spots you have to clean up, so it goes together very well. And you get a great muzzle brake assembly style in the kit. Sometimes plastic muzzle brakes go together weirdly and give you obvious gaps, which shouldn't be there. But the way this brake goes together is ingenious, and it gets rid of all the gaps, and it looks really, really good. You also have on the sprue 2 other muzzle brakes which are unused. I'll call them a mid-late, which you could arguably use in this kit, and also a mid, which is unused and will eventually feature on another rifle StuG, I guess, when they release other versions. So following the order of the instructions, now suddenly we're going to look at the engine deck. It's a bit weird how they jump around, but it's okay. So the engine deck in the kit's very good. One piece of assembly, mostly with the interlocking welds along the side. You can kind of maybe see them there. The actual attachment method for these ventilator covers is much better than in the Dragon kits, where it's a little bit weak. You got nice PE here for the barrel cleaning rods and everything like that, and you do get the photo etch for the corresponding mounts for the late style of retention hooks there. So it's all very good for the engine deck. Also get the photo etch rail for stowage, which is great. There's only really two things wrong, and those both correspond to these ventilators on the side here. First thing is that I pointed out already, the mesh they give you is wrong. They give you a crisscross style mesh. Think of it as X's when it should be like pluses. Basically the angle's wrong for the mesh. You can get aftermarket mesh to fix this from RFM model and also from Griffin model. I've ordered it, it's coming. If you don't really care about these tiny things, just use the photo etch they give you the kit because it's okay. The next thing is that these ventilators should have interlocking welds along the edge. It is very hard for me to even point out to you now where it is, and that just shows you how not really visible this correction is. But there should be interlocking welds along the edges there. The kit gives you the straight welds, which are appropriate for earlier vehicles. So I did go through and scrape off some of that weld, and I carved in the interlocks, and then I carved in the weld detail. But you can't really even see it now. It's barely visible, so it's not exactly a big issue with the kit. So now the instructions have us go back to the fenders, and we put on all the tools and everything else. So the tool clamp method in this kit, I think, is the best middle ground between high level detail but also not being crazy complicated. So usually in kits, the tools are molded with the clamps just kind of big blobs attached to them. They don't look that good, so I will add complicated multi-part photo etch assemblies or aftermarket 3D printed parts or something like that to make it look good. In this kit, they do a hybrid where most of the clamp is gone to the handle of the tool, but then you have a separate photo etch part which just encompasses the handle. So you get a nice level of detail compromise. It is a little bit fiddly because the parts are kind of small, but you have to bend them a little bit, and then you just put them on pretty straightforward with a little bit of glue. And I think, like I said before, it's the best compromise between complexity and detail. You do get full photo etch tool clamps for the C-hooks, which are these things here, and I'm very happy to say that this kit has finally given us C-hook clamps. This has been a thing that's missing from every other late StuG kit, even mid StuG kits, ever. Finally, we have it. On the back of the fender here, they have you put on the fire extinguisher and the rear light. It's not quite right what they call it for in the kit. First of all, they have you put on a boxy style of rear light, which is arguably okay. I've seen it on like one late StuG. Usually they have the tubular style, which is what I put on for my spares bin, but the boxy style is okay, I guess. They also have you put on the fire extinguisher in an angled position, which is correct for anything other than a late vehicle. So a late vehicle should have the fire extinguisher as I have it here, which is located linearly close to the edge of the engine deck. I also think that you should use a late style of fire extinguisher, which has only one strap instead of two. So I used a aftermarket part from T-Rex 3D printed accessory. This is another super minor thing. You can just use the kit part with the two straps, just glue it straight close to the fender, and it'll be okay, I guess. So while we're talking about the tools, I will point out the jack. So I've added a different piece for the foot of the jack here at the end. Sorry, it's kind of hard to see because of the side skirt mounting rail, but the part that I've added has, you can see, like an exposed plus shape in the foot. The kit part doesn't have that, it's just kind of flat, which is actually an earlier style of jack foot. So it's, again, a super minor thing, but the jack foot should be like this. Alright, now for the tow cables. I use some aftermarket parts here because there's a few things I want to talk about. So first of all, I used a spare metal cable for the actual cable itself because the kit gives you kind of like a thread, you know, which you sometimes get in Tamiya kits, whatever, and it's not that good. I want to use the proper metal cable because it looks a lot better. I also use aftermarket parts for the clamps because the kit gives you the earlier style of clamp, molded with the heads of the cable. This is an earlier style of clamp. It's more round. The later style should be a boxy one, which is not included in the kit. So you can get that boxy one from Model Casting. They make it. Older set, number A7, but it might still be possible to find it. Or you can get it from 3D print company Elephant Model Accessories, which is pretty new, and it's probably a lot easier to find this set. And it comes with some other details as well, so you can probably just go with that one if you want to correct it. I ended up actually using the Model Casting ones just because I had one set left and I just wanted to get rid of it. But like I said, the Model Casting set or the Elephant Model Accessories set are both good options. And because the eyelets, the cable ends in the kit are molded with the bad tool clamps, I used T-Rex 3D printed cable ends because I didn't want to sand off the bad clamps. I just wanted to get on with the build. Alright, now for the Superstructure roof. You do have to drill out a couple holes to mount some of these details. Just a couple holes to drill. You put on the close defense weapon, and then you drill a few more holes, and then you put on the splash guard for the cupola, which has beautiful welds molded already into it. Usually you'd have to add all those welds yourself along the edges there, but that's really, really cool that they're included like that. You do have an interior for the hatch. It's not exactly right, let's say. If you want to have the cupola hatch open, there really should be this big late style of handle, which I've kind of sketched on here, included as a photo etch part or something like that. But they do give you the late style of handle, welded style for the tiny binocular flap. I don't know why they included that if they didn't include the other one. Now for the actual bump stop, they give you the earlier style, which is one that holds the cupola open at 45 degrees. Late vehicles have a little tiny plug there instead, which just lets the hatch sit all the way open. So I had to put a little bit of putty on there and fill the slots for the earlier style of bump stop, and then I just sand it smooth, and then I used some styrene rod as the part for just a little tiny bump stop. So looking in more detail at the cupola, you can see that we have a photo etched piece of strip which you have to kind of bend and put inside there. It's like a splash guard behind the periscopes. It's actually pretty easy to put this part in. It looks like you have to actually bend it and then pop it into place, but you don't actually have to curve it. You can just kind of pop it into one side, and then as you roll it, and it'll bend as you slot it in the whole thing. Hopefully that made some sense, I don't know. You also have a nice piece of photo etch for the little flap here, which corresponds to this part here, which slides back and forth as the gun would move and move the periscope around. The fact that this is a photo etch part and not a big molded on blob just adds a nice little level of detail to the kit. So the cupola actually I've left separate. I always do this because the clear parts for the periscopes, you can actually put them in later after painting if you leave the cupola separate because they go in from the bottom. So what I do is I just put the kit together like this, I paint it, take this out later, and I can put the clear parts in and then put it back on and glue it when the whole thing's painted and weathered. The machine gun shield is very detailed and actually has a workable elevation. It does give you the actual machine gun, including an ammo drum, but I haven't actually put that on there because I wanted to leave it empty on this build for whatever reason. I'm going to give you guys a trick for putting together any StuG kit ever. They always have you glue on this part here. They have it glued to the superstructure. When you do that, you can't get the gun out, and it's important to be able to get the gun out for painting. I'll show you why. Because how else are you going to get paint in there? It's going to be bare plastic, so you have to leave it separate so eventually you can pop the gun out like this, and then you can get paint in here, and you can get paint in these hard to reach spots when you're airbrushing the model, and then you can put it together in the end. But you can't get the gun out if you leave this part glued to the superstructure, as they say. So you have to glue it to the roof like this. It's a bit tricky to do so, but you just have to make sure that you only put glue along the little edge where it meets up with the superstructure roof, and then you just, you carefully put it in place there. You can apply a little bit more glue, fiddle around with it, and then very quickly after I put it in there, I pop the roof out to make sure that any glue that escaped doesn't glue the whole thing down. So a little bit earlier on, I mentioned that I had to scrape off the locating point or whatever, the little base for the chain, which was roughly there. You can see a little white spot. Having it down there is appropriate for earlier vehicles and also for the other factory late vehicles. Late vehicles of the factory, Alket, which made this vehicle as the kit builds, had their chain located up in the top corner here. So what I did was, because I already sliced that part off, I used a little spare piece of bone wedge for the remaking that part to cut off. And then I used the kit spring, and then I added a diesel details chain to replace the foot wedge chain in the kit. And then you've got the actual travel lock here, and you can also model it upright, holding the gun in place. The no-tech light here is 3D printed. The kit part is okay, perfectly fine. I just had a more detailed 3D printed option, so I used that. And again, here's the chain I used for the travel lock there. Diesel details, 40 links per inch. Now let's talk about the side skirts. This kit gives you side skirt panels. You've got 4 per side. Front one, you got 2 of this type which go in the middle, there and there, and then you've got a 1 at the rear. In real life, there's a doubler plate on the inside of the 2 center panels. I'll show you some pictures here of the real thing. This doubler plate is not included in the kit, and it should be there. So I made it by sacrificing the other 2 of these panels, and I just cut them off and I glued them to the inside of this panel. I'll show you a clip of that here. These are just photo etch sheet essentially, so it takes a little while to kind of score it and then bend it and break it off, but it wasn't too complicated. And this here is kind of the assembly you get at the end. It's not quite perfect because the real thing is a little bit more complicated, and maybe it should go a little lower. I cut it above that little mount there, but I think it should be lower on. There's some variation here on some vehicles, it looks like. Because I had to sacrifice 2 out of my 4 center panels, I can't do the full side skirts. I can just do, I can do 3 per side basically. The last thing I want to point out is some welds that I added. I used Archer resin weld decals, which are just basically decals, but they're actually resin welds essentially. So you cut out whatever length you need and you just apply like a decal. I did this in a few spots. I'll point them out here. I did it kind of along the edge of the armor I added there. Also on the other side, right there. I did it on the rear of the hull because the interlocking wasn't quite complete with the welds that they give you. Most critically, I did it on the interlocking of the hull transmission front plate area, whatever. So like I pointed out, the late vehicles had interlocking hull fronts, engine decks, hull rears, ventilators on the side of the engine deck. The transmission plate also interlocks with the hull side, and the welds are barely visible along the edge of the fender there. So I did model that simply by adding a little bit of these Archer resin weld decals. And it's just like applying any other decal. These are really useful for just little welds that are missing from the kit, so these are pretty standard for me on some of my builds. I'll also point out that there's one more spot I added a weld decal, and that's right on the top of the gun recuperator right there. Alright, we are done. That encompasses the whole Ryefield build and also any of the problems I encountered and the changes I made and everything like that. So hopefully that video wasn't super long and boring, but maybe it was informative and interesting to some people out there. Like I said, this kit is 95% of the way there in terms of all the features that should be there and details and everything like that. Few small things I added are small, tiny details like the tow cable clamps and the fire extinguisher straps and the mesh pattern, small things like that that most people don't care about. To most people, stock, this kit looks appropriate, and it basically is. If you want to do any Ardennes StuG or any of the late war ones, this kit is an excellent choice. Much better than any of the other options out there like the Takom, Blitz, late StuG, and the old Dragon kit. I really enjoyed the build. Only thing I didn't like was the fact that some of the assemblies like the lower hull, interior bits, and the superstructure were a little bit overly complicated because there's also an interior version and they just kind of reused some complicated parts to make everything more simple for them to mold, but not simple for me to build. If you like my work, you can support me with Patreon. I'm on the link on screen now. People there who give me a little bit of money every month really helps me buying kits, like for example pre-ordering this one and getting my review out to you guys nice and early. It's much appreciated, people who support me there, and they do get early access to some of my content. Anyways, I'll see you guys next time. Until then, goodbye, stay safe and happy modeling.